Elijah Marsh had $3.4 billion. That night, all of it was useless against a house, with no heat on Lafayette Avenue. He would tell people later that he almost drove past it, that the only reason he stopped was a porch light flickering behind a window caked in frost, on a street where every other house was dark. That the temperature reading on his dashboard said -11, and the wind was doing something to the snow that made it look like it was moving sideways instead of down. That inside that house were two children, ages 12 and 8, wrapped in every blanket they owned, boiling snow for drinking water on a little butane camp stove, because the furnace, and now the power, had both failed. What he would not say, not for months, was that the woman, whose name was on the mailbox, D. Coleman, in peeling gold stick-on letters, was the reason he had a company at all. This is the story of the night $3 billion meant nothing, and $40 once meant everything. 2 hours before he found them, Elijah Marsh was supposed to be on a flight to Charlotte. The flight had been canceled at 3:15 that afternoon, along with almost every other departure out of Buffalo Niagara International. But by then Elijah had already half decided he wasn't getting on a plane anyway, not with company shelter cots going up on Niagara Street, and a skeleton crew working overtime to keep the lights and the generators running for anyone who had nowhere else to be warm that night. Instead, he was behind the wheel of a Chevrolet Suburban that was not his. His driver, Reggie, lived in Cheektowaga and had called at 4:40 in the afternoon to say the roads off Harlem Road were already impassable, and he was not going to risk the drive-in. Elijah told him to stay home. He said it the way he said most things, flat and certain, the voice of a man who had signed contracts worth more than some country's GDP. What he did not say was that he was relieved. He wanted, for once, to be the one behind the wheel. The storm had a name by then. The National Weather Service was calling it a life-threatening lake effect event, the kind Buffalo got maybe once every 4 or 5 years, the kind old-timers still measured other storms against. For years earlier, a storm like this one had killed 31 people in Erie County, some of them found in their cars, some of them found in their homes, one of them a man who froze 8 feet from his own back door. Elijah remembered that storm. He had kept his headquarters open, through it as a shelter for anyone who needed one, because his mother had raised him to believe that a man with resources and no willingness to use them for other people was not really a man at all. She used to say it a different way. Cold don't ask who you are before it takes something from you. Loretta Marsh had said that sentence to her son so many times across 31 years that by the time Elijah was running a company with 14,000 employees, it had stopped sounding like a warning and started sounding like a business plan. The dashboard clock read 5:52 in the evening when he pulled out of the parking garage beneath Marsh Dynamics headquarters on Delaware Avenue, and by 6:10 the city had gone the particular silent loud that only a serious lake effect storm produces. No traffic noise, no voices, nothing but wind moving snow sideways past streetlights and ropes, so thick the light itself seemed to bend. He passed one snowplow in 20 minutes, its amber beacon smeared into a soft orange blur by the snow accumulating on his windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. The radio kept cutting to emergency alerts. A countywide driving ban would take effect at 8 in the evening, still almost 2 hours off, but every alert already on the air was urging drivers to get off the roads immediately, ban or no ban, which was its own kind of warning Elijah was choosing, for the moment, to ignore. He was driving to check on a distribution hub on Niagara Street. Marsh Dynamics ran cold chain logistics, refrigerated trucking, warehouse robotics, the unglamorous infrastructure that kept grocery stores stocked and hospitals supplied. And in a storm like this, the company's generators were doing double duty, powering not just the warehouse, but a block of emergency shelter cots the city had asked him to set up 11 days earlier, when the forecasts first turned ugly. He never made it to Niagara Street. 6 blocks north of it, his Suburban's tires lost their grip on a patch of black ice disguised under 4 inches of fresh powder, and he ended up nose first against a snowbank on Lafayette Avenue, engine still running, 23 degrees below zero, with the wind chill, in a neighborhood he had not driven through in 19 years. He sat there for a minute, cursing, calling roadside assistance, and getting a recording that said wait times were currently over 6 hours. And that was when he saw the porch light. Flickering. Weak. A candle, not electricity. The block had lost power 40 minutes earlier, according to the utility company's outage map glowing on his phone. Every house on the street was dark except that one flame in a window, and something about it, maybe just the stubbornness of it, one small light refusing a whole blackout, made him get out of the car. The wind took his breath the second he opened the door, the kind of cold that does not feel like weather so much as an assault, personal, deliberate. He crossed the yard in 11 steps, boots sinking to his shins, and knocked on a door, with paint peeling in long gray strips. A boy answered, maybe 12, wearing 2 coats, a knit hat pulled low, cheeks raw and chapped, a butter knife in one hand held the way a kid holds something he does not actually think will help him, but needs to be holding anyway. "We don't want anything," the boy said, before Elijah had spoken a word. "My uncle's coming back soon." Elijah looked past him, into a living room lit by 3 candles and a camping lantern, where a girl, 6 or 7 years younger than the boy, maybe 8, sat on a couch buried under a mountain of coats and blankets, breath visible in the air in front of her face. A pot sat on that same portable butane stove, moved to the coffee table, snow melting in it for water, because, Elijah would learn, within the hour, the pipes had frozen solid 2 days earlier, and nobody had come to fix them. The furnace itself had failed 4 days. Before that, a cracked heat exchanger the landlord kept promising to send someone about, so the house had already been running cold for the better part of a week before tonight's outage took the lights too. "How long's the power been out?" Elijah asked. "Since 5, maybe 5:30. The boy's voice cracked on the second sentence, and something in his face, the effort of holding a grown man's composure on a 12-year-old's face, made Elijah's chest tighten in a way $3 billion had never once managed to do. "Where's your uncle?" The boy's jaw worked. "Working," he said, too fast, too flat, a lie with the edges not quite sanded down. Elijah had built and sold and negotiated with enough people to know a lie built out of loyalty when he heard one, the kind kids tell to protect an adult who does not deserve the protection. "What's your name, son?" "Tyler." "A beat." "Tyler Coleman." "That's my sister, Ava." "Coleman." Elijah felt something shift under his ribs, quiet and enormous, the way a house settles at night. He had seen that name 20 minutes ago, in gold stick-on letters on a mailbox buried in snow, and had not thought anything of it, because Coleman is not a rare name. But hearing it spoken out loud, in a boy's cracked voice, in a house going dark and cold on a night that was already trying to kill people across the county, it landed somewhere old. "Is your mama home?" Elijah asked, gentler now. Tyler's face did something complicated. He looked at the floor. Ava, on the couch, made a small sound, not quite a sob, and pulled a blanket higher. "Our mom died," Tyler said. 19 days ago." The wind screamed against the house. Somewhere down the block, a transformer popped and sparked orange against the low gray sky. "Then you two are coming with me," Elijah said. "Right now? Get everything warm you can wear." To understand why Elijah Marsh, a man whose calendar was managed 11 weeks in advance, whose net worth had been profiled in 3 national magazines, who had not personally driven a vehicle in a snowstorm in over a decade, pulled 2 strange children into his car on the worst night of the year, you have to go back 39 years to a 2-bedroom rental on Buffalo's east side, where a boy named Elijah shared a room with 2 brothers and learned, before he learned much else, exactly what it cost to be poor in a cold place. His father, Samuel Marsh, had worked the line at the Bethlehem steel plant in Lackawanna, 6 miles south of the city, for 11 years, until the day in 1983 the company shut it down and put 7,000 men out of work in a single announcement. Elijah was 4 years old. He would not remember the day itself, but he would spend the rest of his childhood living inside its consequences. A father who took whatever work he could find, most of it seasonal, most of it hard on the body, and a mother, Loretta, who worked the industrial laundry at Buffalo General Medical Center, folding hospital sheets on a floor that flooded every spring, coming home smelling like bleach, and other people's sickness, and never once, in 18 years under that roof, complaining about it, where her children could hear. Loretta Marsh had one saying she repeated, So often it became a kind of scripture in that house. Cold don't ask who you are before it takes something from you. She meant weather. At first, Elijah understood that much. As a boy, walking to school in a coat 2 sizes too big, handed down from a cousin, snow packing into boots, with a hole starting in the left sole. But as he got older, he understood she meant something bigger. Poverty didn't ask who you were, either. Bad luck didn't. The world took what it wanted, from people regardless of whether they deserved to keep it, and the only real defense anyone had was each other. Elijah got out on a scholarship, partial, not full, the difference covered by 2 jobs and a stack of loans that would take him 9 years and $61,000 to pay off, to the university at Buffalo, where he studied mechanical engineering, because an academic advisor told him it was the most employable degree they offered, and employable was the only word that mattered to a 19-year-old whose family had nothing to fall back on. He graduated in 2001, worked 5 years for a refrigeration systems manufacturer, and in 2007, with $14,000 in savings and a business plan nobody wanted to fund, started a single truck operation delivering temperature-controlled food to small grocers who couldn't get contracts with the big distributors. He called it Northern Star Cold Chain. Nearly 2 decades later, it was Marsh Dynamics, 14,000 employees, contracts with half the major hospital systems in the Northeast, a robotics division, a Forbes cover in 2021, with the headline, "The Coldest Business in America Has the Warmest Founder." His marriage had not survived the version of him that a decade of 80-hour weeks produced. He had married Renata Cole in 2011, a commercial real estate broker he'd met, while leasing his first proper warehouse, sharp and ambitious and, in the early years, genuinely fond of him. But somewhere in the long climb, from 1 truck to 14,000 employees, the marriage had quietly become another account he managed instead of a place he lived, and Renata had said as much, not cruelly, the night she told him she wanted a divorce. "I didn't marry a company, Elijah," she'd said. "I keep waking up next to one anyway." Their daughter, Simone, was 16 when they split, and by the time she left for Spelman College 3 years later, the calls between her and her father had thinned to a handful a semester, polite and short, the kind of conversation 2 people have when neither one knows how to say the thing underneath it. Elijah told himself, most years, that Simone's distance was the fair cost of the years he'd spent building something instead of being somewhere. He did not entirely believe himself. It was one of the reasons that porch light on Lafayette Avenue had pulled at him the way it did, some part of him recognizing, before the rest of him caught up, a second chance at showing up for a child that he had not fully managed the first time. He hated that headline. He never told anyone why. But it was because of a night in February 2009, barely 2 years into a business that hadn't yet earned him so much as a mention in the local paper, when Northern Star Cold Chain was a single truck he drove himself, and the truck died on Elmwood Avenue in a snowstorm, with $340 worth of perishables in the back, and Elijah's savings account sitting at negative $14. He remembered that night the way most people remember the worst version of a fear they never fully outran. 29 years old, no cell phone signal, a truck that would not turn over, and a body temperature dropping in a way he could feel happening, the shivering that stops being uncomfortable and starts being frightening, the way your thinking gets slow and stupid right when you need it sharp. A woman found him, young, maybe mid-20s, wearing hospital scrubs under a coat that was not warm enough for the night either, walking home from a shift because her own car had been towed the week before for unpaid tickets, and she could not afford to get it back yet. She saw him slumped against his truck, half conscious, and she did not ask questions. She got him into the nearest open place, a diner 2 blocks down, that stayed open all night for the hospital shift workers, bought him coffee and a plate of eggs, with money she did not have much of, and then, while he sat there shaking and humiliated, she called a tow company and paid the deposit herself, $40 she would tell him later she'd been saving for a winter coat. He tried to get her name. She waved it off. "Pay it forward," she said, sliding out of the booth, checking her watch, because she had another shift to be at in 4 hours. That's the whole deal. And then she was gone, into the snow, and Elijah Marsh never saw her again, never learned her name, never found the diner's old receipts, because the diner closed in 2011 and the records went with it. He tried, on and off, for years, asked around the hospital, described her to nurses, who all shrugged, told the story often enough that it became a kind of parable he used in interviews, the story of the stranger who saved him, minus the details, because the details were the one thing he did not have. What he did have, 17 years later, standing in a freezing house on Lafayette Avenue, was a mailbox that said D. Coleman, a 12-year-old boy who would not meet his eyes, and a framed photograph on the wall above the dead television, a woman in blue scrubs, not much past 40, laughing at something outside the frame, an ID badge clipped to her chest that read Buffalo General Medical Center, Denise Coleman, RN. Elijah stood in that living room for 4 full seconds, without moving, doing math he did not want to do, matching a face he had spent 17 years failing to picture with a photograph on a dead woman's living room wall. He did not say anything about it. Not that night. There would be time. He told himself there would be time, and right then there were 2 children who needed to not freeze to death before midnight. Denise Coleman had not always lived on Lafayette Avenue. She grew up 2 hours south, near Jamestown, the daughter of a machinist and a school cafeteria worker, the kind of childhood where a good report card got you a trip to Friendly's and a bad one got you a talking to. That lasted longer than the report card mattered. She married young Marcus Coleman, an iron worker, steady hands, steadier temper, a man who loved his kids the way he did everything else, quietly and completely. Tyler was born when Denise was 30. Ava came 4 years later. For a while, the Colemans were the kind of family people described as doing fine, not rich, never rich, but fine, a rented house on the west side, with a yard big enough for a swing set Marcus built himself out of lumber he got at a discount from a job site. Then, 4 years before the blizzard, Marcus Coleman had a heart attack on a job site in the middle of July, and by the time the ambulance reached Buffalo General, the hospital where his wife worked, he was gone. He was 36. Denise did not fall apart, or if she did it somewhere her children could not see it. She picked up extra shifts. She learned to do the things Marcus used to do, the gutters, the car, the swing set repairs. She kept a framed photo of him on the nightstand and told Tyler and Ava, on nights when the grief got loud in the house, that their father had loved them enough for 2 people, and it was her job now to make sure that never felt like a lie. She never remarried, never really dated, put every spare hour into 13-hour ICU shifts and every spare dollar into a life insurance policy and a modest custodial savings account she'd been feeding, $50 or $75 whenever she could manage it, since Tyler was in diapers, meant, eventually, for college. She took more overnight shifts than she might have chosen otherwise, most winters, because the overtime paid better than daytime. Roy, and sometimes a neighbor, usually covered the kids when she worked nights, but on the weeks those arrangements fell through, Buffalo General offered its shift workers no emergency backup childcare at all, a gap she complained about to co-workers for years, without anyone ever doing much about it. 19 days before the blizzard, driving home from a night shift at 6:40 in the morning on a stretch of the 190 that had iced over faster than the plows could keep up with, Denise Coleman's car spun into the median barrier. She was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 42 years old. Tyler found out from a police officer who came to the door while he was getting Ava ready for school. He was 12. He remembered, with total clarity, that the officer's radio kept crackling the whole time he was talking, and that he could not stop staring at it instead of the officer's face, because looking at the officer's face meant the words were real. Denise's will named her younger brother, Roy Coleman, as legal guardian for Tyler and Ava if anything ever happened to her. It was a decision she made when Ava was born, back when Roy was 22 and stable and dating someone Denise liked, back before a series of things went wrong for him that had nothing to do with his character and everything to do with the kind of bad luck that compounds a factory job that moved to Ohio, a relationship that ended badly, a habit of stopping at the OTB on his way home from his warehouse shifts that started as nothing and, somewhere in the 2 years before his sister died, stopped being nothing. In the 19 days between Denise's funeral and the blizzard, The Coleman house on Lafayette Avenue ran on a kind of borrowed normalcy that Tyler, years later, would describe as the hardest part of the whole year, harder, in some ways, than the storm itself. Casseroles arrived from neighbors for the first week and then stopped arriving. A grief counselor from the school district came twice, and then, overloaded with other cases, never rescheduled a third visit. Ava kept setting a fourth plate at dinner some nights, a habit nobody had the heart to correct, and Tyler took, over signing his own school permission slips, because he'd noticed, without saying anything, that Roy sometimes forgot which forms existed at all. It was a house full of people trying, none of them equipped, all of them grieving the same woman from different, lonelier angles. Roy was 30 when he inherited 2 children he loved and had no idea how to raise. He moved into the Lafayette Avenue house because it made more sense than uprooting the kids from their school, their friends, the only home Ava could remember clearly. For the first 2 weeks, he tried, genuinely, the way people try, when grief and responsibility arrive at the same time, and neither one gives the other room to be handled properly. He made sure they got to school. He learned Ava took her sandwiches, with the crusts cut off, and Tyler didn't like anyone talking to him before 9 in the morning. He cried in the garage, where he thought they couldn't hear him, and some nights they could. But Roy Coleman also owed $9,400 to 2 different sports books, and a man he had borrowed, from directly, debts that predated his sister's death by 2 years, and did not care that he was grieving now. What Denise had left behind, along with the will naming him guardian, was a custodial savings account she'd built for Tyler and Ava since Tyler was in diapers, $50 or $75 at a time, whenever the budget allowed it, until it held $8,800, with Roy named as trustee because there had never, in the 12 years she'd been feeding that account, been any reason to think he'd need watching. 11 days before the blizzard, staring at a collections notice and a personal account, with $340 in it, Roy made the first withdrawal from his niece and nephew's savings that he told himself he'd pay back before anyone noticed. He did not stop noticing himself doing it. He just kept doing it anyway, the way people do, when the shame of the first time becomes easier to live, within the shame of stopping and admitting what the first time was. On the day the blizzard warnings turned into blizzard reality, Roy Coleman told Tyler he was going to pick up extra groceries and would be back before the worst of it hit. He drove instead to the Seneca Niagara Casino, 22 miles north, where he told himself one good night could clear the debt and fix everything quietly before anyone ever had to know what he'd done. He was still there at midnight, snowed in along, with 400 other stranded gamblers, another $400 of his niece and nephew's savings gone at the blackjack table, while his sister's children sat in a freezing house boiling snow for drinking water. Freeing the Suburban took 4 tries in 4-wheel drive low, the tires spinning and catching and spinning again, until they finally bit and walked the truck backward off the snowbank. Elijah got the children into it, cranked the heat to its highest setting, and drove them not toward his own house first, but toward Buffalo General Medical Center, because Ava's fingers, when he'd helped her into her coat, had a waxy, grayish look at the tips that he recognized from a winter 20 years earlier, when his own younger brother had gotten frostbite walking to a bus stop with holes in his gloves. The ER doctor confirmed it, mild frostbite on 2 fingers of Ava's left hand, nothing that would cost her the fingers, but painful, and the kind of thing that needed watching. Tyler checked out fine, physically, though the intake nurse noted in his chart that he answered every question about his own well-being before anyone had finished asking it, a kind of vigilance that 12-year-olds are not supposed to have fully developed yet. It was in the ER waiting room, filling out paperwork as an emergency temporary contact because no other family could be reached, that Elijah finally said the name out loud. Denise Coleman, he said, to no one, reading it off Ava's admission bracelet. Your mom's name was Denise. Tyler, sitting beside him in a plastic chair too big for him, nodded without looking up. She was a nurse. Here, actually. ICU, mostly, but she used to work ER when she was younger. Elijah's hands went still around the clipboard. How long she work ER for? I don't know. Before I was born, some of it. Why? Did she have a saying? Elijah asked, before he could stop himself. Something she used to tell you too, all the time, like it was a rule of the house. Tyler looked at him strangely, the way you look at someone who has just described a room in your house they've never been in. Pay it forward, he said slowly. She had it on a little wood sign by the front door. Said it was the only thing worth teaching us, that she couldn't put in a lunchbox. He paused. How'd you know that? Elijah looked at the boy for a long moment. Tyler's jaw, set the same stubborn way, as in the photograph on the living room wall, the photograph of a woman laughing at something outside the frame, and he thought about 17 years and $40 and a diner that didn't exist anymore, and a debt he had spent nearly 2 decades unable to repay, because he never learned who to repay it to. No reason, he said. Just, I think I might have known her. A long time ago. He would tell Tyler the whole truth eventually. Not that night. That night was not for his story, it was for theirs. He took the kids home. With him, a house in the historic Elmwood Village, 6 bedrooms, most of them unused, since his daughter left for college, and his marriage ended 3 years earlier, and called Carol Jennings, an Erie County Child Protective Services caseworker he knew, through the company's community partnerships, at 11:40 at night, waking her up. Because he did not know the correct emergency process for what he was doing, and did not particularly care about following it exactly. You can't just keep 2 kids at your house, because you found them, Elijah, Carol told him, not unkindly, her voice thick with sleep. There's a process. I know there's a process. I'm following the process. I'm calling you. A pause. Carol, it's 23 below, with the wind chill. Their mother's dead. Their guardian left them alone in a house, with no heat, and disappeared. Tell me what the process is for that, because I will do exactly that, tonight, but I am not putting an 8-year-old, with frostbite back in a car in this storm to go to some overflow shelter cot. The line was quiet for a length of time Elijah would remember later, as unusually long, 9 seconds, maybe 10, the sound of a tired woman weighing a rulebook against a night that had already, by that hour, claimed 2 lives elsewhere in the county to exposure. I'll file it, as an emergency placement, Carol said finally. The county's already declared a state of emergency, which means I've got more room to authorize this, over the phone than I would on a normal night, but I still need your date of birth and your social security number right now, for the background check, and a patrol officer walks through that house, with me at 8 a.m., before anything's official. Temporary only, Elijah. You understand this doesn't mean anything long-term. There's a guardian on file. There's a whole legal process before anything like what you're probably already thinking about becomes possible. Elijah gave her the numbers, twice, so she could read them back and be sure she had them right. I understand, he said. He did not, yet, fully understand how long, or how complicated, that process would be. He only understood that Ava had fallen asleep in his guest room 40 minutes earlier still wearing her coat, because some part of her did not trust, yet, that the warmth in the house was going to last. Over the next 4 months, after Roy was found and, later, formally charged, Elijah worked through every step the county required of a non-relative emergency caregiver. A full background check, a home study, that involved a caseworker walking every room of his house, with a clipboard, in-person interviews, with him and, separately, with each of the children, and a parenting capacity evaluation, with a court-assigned psychologist who came to the house twice. None of it was fast, and none of it was guaranteed. Carol reminded him more than once that plenty of well-meaning emergency placements did not end in permanent ones. Elijah did all of it anyway, on the county's schedule, without once trying to speed the process along the way a man, with his resources, usually could. The first weeks were not a montage of easy healing. Ava startled at loud sounds. The ice maker in Elijah's refrigerator, on the first morning, made her drop a glass, and she flinched so hard and apologized, so fast that Elijah had to leave the kitchen for a minute to compose himself, before he could tell her, gently, that it was just ice, that nothing in this house was going to be taken away from her because of a dropped glass. Tyler barely spoke, unless spoken to, did his homework, with an intensity that looked less like diligence and more like control. One thing, at least, he could manage, and would not go to sleep, Elijah learned on the 3rd night. until he had personally checked that both exterior doors were locked, a habit that had started, it turned out, on the night his uncle first didn't come home when he said he would. Elijah did not try to fix any of it quickly. He had learned enough, in building a company, about the difference between solving a problem and rushing a person to know those were not the same skill. He showed up. He made breakfast, badly, most mornings, burnt the first 4 attempts at pancakes, so completely that Ava started keeping score, out loud, with something like delight, the first sound he'd have called genuinely happy come out of her. He learned that Tyler liked to talk about basketball, but only if you talked about it like it mattered, not like you were performing interest in a kid's hobby. He learned Ava had a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit that had, impossibly, survived the walk from the freezing house to the hospital to Elijah's home, and that Biscuit's left ear was held on, with thread Denise Coleman had sewn herself, and that this fact, when Ava told it to him one evening, was the first time either child had said their mother's name out loud, without their whole face closing like a door. Same time tomorrow became a thing Elijah started saying at the end of each night, standing in the doorway of whichever room he was saying good night in, and after the 9th or 10th night, Tyler started saying it back, first as a kind of test, then, eventually, like he meant it. The trust did not arrive all at once. It arrived in small, specific increments that Elijah started, almost without deciding to, keeping a mental ledger of. Day 6. Ava let him braid her hair, before school, badly, and laughed at the result instead of asking to redo it herself. Day 12. Tyler mentioned, unprompted, that his mother used to make a Sunday dish called red rice, with andouille sausage, a recipe from her own grandmother in Jamestown, and Elijah spent the following Saturday afternoon on the phone, with a cousin of Denise's he tracked down, through the hospital, taking notes like the recipe was a contract worth renegotiating, and got it close enough that Tyler ate 2 full plates, without saying a word, which Elijah understood, by then, to be the highest compliment the boy currently had available to give. Day 19. Ava asked, out of nowhere, over cereal, whether it was okay to still love her mom, and also be happy sometimes, and Elijah put his coffee down, and told her that was not only okay, it was the only way grief was supposed to work, and that anyone who told her differently didn't understand it very well. Day 31. Tyler joined the chess club at his new school, a decision he announced the way other kids might announce something faintly embarrassing, and asked Elijah, looking anywhere but at him, if he'd maybe want to come to the first tournament, if you're not busy, or whatever. Elijah cleared his entire calendar for that Saturday 11 minutes after Tyler left the room. There were harder days too, days the ledger didn't capture as neatly, a night in week 5, when Ava woke up screaming from a dream about the cold house, and would not be consoled for 40 minutes, a morning when Tyler snapped at Elijah for a question, as ordinary as whether he wanted juice, and then locked himself in the bathroom for half an hour, ashamed, unable yet to explain that the ordinariness itself was what had cracked something open. Elijah did not try to talk either of them out of those days. He had learned, slowly, that the job in front of him was not to accelerate their healing, but simply to still be standing there, unchanged and unbothered, on the other side of it. Roy Coleman was found on the 3rd day, after the storm, when the casino finally cleared enough for stranded guests to leave, sitting in his truck in the parking lot, with a phone battery long dead, and a voicemail inbox full of messages from a caseworker he had never heard of. He drove home to a house that had a Child Protective Services notice taped to the door, and neighbors who told him, in careful tones, that his niece and nephew had been taken by ambulance 3 nights earlier, and nobody seemed to know where. When he finally reached Carol Jennings, and then, an hour later, reached Elijah Marsh by phone, his voice broke somewhere in the second sentence. "I never meant for that," he started and stopped. "I was going to be back before the worst of it. I didn't think it'd get that bad that fast. You left 2 kids alone in a house, with no heat during the worst storm this county's seen in years," Elijah said, keeping his voice level, with real effort, "to go gamble at a casino." There was a silence on the line that Elijah counted, without meaning to, the way he'd started counting silences that mattered lately. 14 seconds. "I know how it looks," Roy said finally. I know what I did. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I got a good reason, because I don't. Somebody lent me a charger the second night I was stuck there. I saw a caseworker's number I didn't recognize, and yours, and I told myself it could wait till I figured out what to say. Then it was morning, and I still couldn't make myself call. Then it was another day. I lost my sister, and I didn't know how to carry that and be somebody's whole world at the same time. And instead of asking for help, I told myself one good night would fix it, and then I was too ashamed to even pick up the phone. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. Elijah did not say anything for a while. He was thinking about a diner and a woman in scrubs who did not have much either, who could have kept walking past a stranger stranded in the cold, and instead spent $40 she needed on a coat she didn't buy that winter. He was thinking about how easy it would be to hate Roy Coleman completely, and how that would be simpler, and how simple was not always honest. "Where is her money, Roy?" he said instead. Not a question. The kid's savings. Where'd it go? The silence this time lasted 23 seconds. Elijah counted every one of them. "I'll pay it back," Roy said. "Every cent. I swear to God I will." "That's not what I asked you." Carol Jennings was the one who insisted the trust account get a real forensic look before anyone decided what, if anything, Roy Coleman had actually done wrong. With it, grief made people careless with money in ways that weren't criminal, she told Elijah, and she'd seen caseworkers ruin a family's last chance at reconciliation by treating a mess as a crime. She brought in a semi-retired forensic accountant named Walter Higgins, who had spent 26 years auditing nonprofits and small estates for the county, and did this kind of work now mostly out of a converted garage on Hurdle Avenue for a fraction of what a downtown firm would charge. Higgins laid the 19 days of activity on the children's custodial account side by side, with a full year of Roy's own overdue notice history, which Higgins had pulled, with Roy's reluctant consent, and what took him 2 afternoons to find. He explained to Elijah and Carol in plain, unhurried language, was not a single dramatic theft, but a slow leak that had simply moved fast because the account was sitting right there, and the man managing it was drowning $150 out. For days, after Denise's funeral, miscellaneous, then $310 6 days. After that, then a pattern that accelerated every time a new collections call came in, each withdrawal traceable almost to the hour against a matching overdue notice in Roy's own name. "This isn't someone running a scheme," Higgins told them, tapping the highlighted rows with a pen that had seen better decades. "A scheme has a plan. This is someone drowning and grabbing whatever's nearest, over and over, and never once making it back to shore. Doesn't make it not a crime, but it tells you something about what kind of crime it is." That distinction, a drowning man instead of a predator, was the thing Carol carried into her report, and the thing that would matter 11 weeks later, when a judge decided a warehouse worker's mistake did not require a warehouse worker's ruin. The investigation that followed was not the kind, with courtroom dramatics, no dramatic gavel, no perp walk for cameras, because Roy Coleman was not a Wall Street executive with a scheme spanning shell companies. He was a grieving 30-year-old warehouse worker with a gambling problem and a checking account, in Erie County Child Protective Services, working with the county's Department of Social Services. Laid the facts out plainly enough. In the 19 days between his sister's funeral and the night of the storm, Roy had withdrawn $6,050 of the $8,800 sitting in the custodial savings account he administered for Tyler and Ava, money Denise had built for them across 12 years, gone in 19 days. He had not spent it recklessly in a single reckless night. It had gone in installments, $200 here, for $100 there, each time telling himself he'd replace it before anyone checked, the ordinary math of an addiction rather than a criminal enterprise. The state charged him with endangering the welfare of a child and misappropriation of a minor's trust funds. His public defender arranged a plea. He did not fight it. He stood in front of a judge on a Tuesday morning in March, in a courtroom, with maybe 11 people in the gallery, and when asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he said, in a voice that did not try to sound better than it was, that his sister trusted him to keep her children safe, and he had failed that trust in every way a person could fail it, and that he did not expect Tyler or Ava to forgive him. and that he was not asking the court for mercy so much as a chance to prove, slowly, over a long time, that he could become someone worth forgiving. The judge gave him 5 years probation, mandatory gambling addiction treatment, 200 hours of community service, and a restitution order for the full $6,050, plus interest, to be repaid to a trust for Tyler and Ava's benefit. No prison. Some people in the gallery, a few of Denise's old co-workers from the hospital, who had come to support the children they remembered visiting the ICU floor in miniature scrubs on Take Your Kid to Work Day, years earlier, muttered that it wasn't enough. Elijah, sitting in the back row, with Ava's hand in his, because Tyler had asked, quietly, not to be there, did not think it was his place to decide whether it was enough. He had learned, over 3 months, that some things about this story were not his to resolve. Ava's grandmother, Denise, and Roy's mother, Gloria Price, 68 years old, living alone in Macon, Georgia, on a fixed income and an oxygen concentrator she needed 6 hours out of every day, since a diagnosis of COPD 2 years earlier, had not been able to take the children in when Denise died, a fact that had sat in Tyler's chest for months as a second abandonment layered on top of the first. Gloria could not fly easily, could not climb the stairs of the Lafayette Avenue house even. If she could have afforded to move north, could not, in any practical sense the county's guardianship evaluators would accept, care for an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old alone. She called Elijah in February, her voice thin, over a bad connection, and told him she was ashamed, that word, specifically, ashamed, that she had let her daughter's children be raised by strangers, because her own body had given out on her, and she asked him, plainly, whether he would let her come see them before the custody hearing, even though she knew, medically, what the trip might cost her. She came in April, 11 days before the final guardianship hearing, that would decide, formally, whether Elijah Marsh would become Tyler and Ava's legal guardian and, eventually, their adoptive father. Gloria Price flew from Macon to Buffalo with a portable oxygen tank and a suitcase that was mostly photographs of Denise as a girl, of Marcus and Denise's wedding, of Tyler as a newborn in his grandmother's arms. She sat on Elijah's back porch, with Ava curled against her side, and told stories for 6 straight hours, stopping only to catch her breath, and at the end of the visit she looked at Elijah and said, "I can't raise them. God knows I wish I could. But I can tell this court, and I can tell these babies, that you are exactly who my daughter would have chosen if anyone had ever asked her to choose." There was another relative who did not come, Marcus Coleman's older brother, Dwayne, who lived 90 minutes away in Rochester, and had, in the chaotic week after Denise's funeral, told a county intake worker, over the phone, that he had his own kids to think about, and never called again, not once, in the 14 months that followed, not for a birthday, not for the hearing, not even to ask how the children were doing. Tyler mentioned him only once, months later, in passing, the way you mention a fact you've made peace with rather than a wound still open. He sent a card at Christmas, Tyler said. No letter, just his name signed at the bottom. Ava doesn't remember him at all. Elijah did not press for more. Some absences do not need investigating. They explain themselves. After flying back to Macon, she testified at the hearing 11 days later by a video call the court set up, so she would not have to risk a second flight, her oxygen line visible in the frame the whole time, and nobody in the courtroom suggested it undercut her credibility. It did the opposite. The guardianship hearing itself took 4 hours, in a family court building on Delaware Avenue, in front of a judge named Patricia Halloran, who had, by her own account on the bench, presided over more than 2,000 custody matters in 19 years, and had never once, she said, seen a case where quite so many strangers wanted to speak in someone's favor. Carol Jennings testified about the emergency placement and the 11 weekly home visits since. The ER physician, who had treated Ava's frostbite, testified that the injury had healed completely, no lasting damage. Tyler's school guidance counselor testified that his grades, which had cratered after his mother's death, had climbed back to where they'd been by April, and that he had, for the first time all year, joined an after-school activity, the chess club, of all things, a detail that made Judge Halloran smile for the only time in the whole proceeding. Roy Coleman, still on probation, still attending mandatory treatment twice a week, was permitted to speak. He did not ask for custody. He asked, instead, that whatever the court decided, he be allowed supervised visits, eventually, when Tyler and Ava were ready, because he loved them, and he understood he had forfeited the right to demand anything beyond the chance, someday, to try to earn it back. Tyler was 12, old enough that the court asked, privately, in chambers, what he wanted. He said he wanted to stay with Elijah. He said it, without hesitation. The guidance counselor would later tell Elijah, in a way that suggested the boy had been waiting for someone to ask him that question directly for a long time. Judge Halloran granted Elijah Marsh legal guardianship that day, with a formal adoption process to follow once the state's mandatory waiting period expired. Ava, sitting in the front row of the gallery in a dress she had picked out herself that morning, with an unusual and total confidence, asked Elijah in the hallway afterward if this meant he was her dad now. "It means I'm not going anywhere," Elijah told her, crouching down to her eye level, because he had learned enough in 4 months not to promise a word to a child before he was sure he could keep it fully. "Whatever we call it, that part's true no matter what." Ava seemed to accept this as sufficient. She held Biscuit up so the rabbit could see the courthouse, whispered something to it Elijah didn't catch, and then took his hand like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Adoption finalized 14 months after the night of the blizzard, on a Thursday in March, in the same family court building, with a proceeding that lasted 11 minutes and left Elijah signing paperwork with a hand that was, to his genuine surprise, not entirely steady. By then, things had changed that were not just legal. Elijah had used $2.1 million of his own money, a figure that made the local paper, though he had asked them, unsuccessfully, not to run it, to establish the Denise Coleman Fund at Buffalo General Medical Center, a program covering emergency childcare, safe rides, and overnight lodging for hospital shift workers who couldn't get home safely or couldn't afford backup care when a storm hit. And a shift ran long, the exact gap that had left Denise driving home on an iced, over highway after 13 straight hours, with no ride, no backup, and no safer option than her own exhausted hands on the wheel. He put Denise's name on it, not his own. When a reporter asked why, he said only, "Because it's her fund. I just wrote the check." Marsh Dynamics launched a program that winter called Warm Route Buffalo, company trucks already moving through the city on delivery routes during severe weather events, repurposed to carry emergency generators, blankets, and wellness checks to households flagged as vulnerable by the county, a program built directly, publicly, out of what had happened to 2 children on Lafayette Avenue. Elijah did not love how often people wanted to make that program about him. He kept redirecting credit toward the drivers, who actually ran the routes in dangerous conditions, and toward a warehouse supervisor named Carla Whitfield, who had designed most of the route logic, and whom Denise Coleman would never get the chance to meet, and toward Tyler, who had asked, that first winter, if the company could put blankets in the trucks for kids like us, a suggestion that became, within a year, standard equipment on every Marsh Dynamics vehicle in 6 states. 18 months after the blizzard, Roy Coleman was still on probation, 3.5 years of it left to go, but 11 months into a gambling recovery program he had stuck with more consistently than anyone, including himself, had expected. He had paid back $3,400 of the $6,050 restitution by then, in monthly installments he never missed. He and Tyler exchanged letters, supervised at first, for almost a year, before Tyler agreed to see him in person, a supervised visit at a park near the Lafayette Avenue house, 40 minutes long, mostly quiet, ending with Roy asking if he could come to Tyler's next chess tournament, and Tyler saying, after a pause Roy would describe later as the longest 40 seconds of his life, that he could come. But he had to sit in the back. Ava has not, as of this writing, agreed to see her uncle at all. She is not angry, exactly. When the subject comes up, she is simply not ready, and Elijah has never once suggested to her that readiness is something she owes anyone on a schedule. Some doors, in this story, have not reopened. Not every ending gets to be complete, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie. Buffalo General Medical Center held a small ceremony the following winter on the one-year anniversary of the storm, to unveil a plaque outside the family childcare room the Denise Coleman Fund had helped build on the ICU floor where she'd worked. 14 nurses came on their break to stand in the hallway for it. Ava, 10 months into calling Elijah Dad, without either of them having formally decided when that started, was the one who pulled the small curtain back from the plaque, and for a moment nobody in the hallway said anything at all, not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone there understood, in the particular way hospital workers understand grief, that some moments are better held in silence than filled with speeches. Tyler read his mother's name out loud once, quietly, like he was checking that it was really there, and then asked if they could go get pancakes, and Elijah, who by then had gotten considerably better at making them, said yes. There is a photograph on the wall of Elijah Marsh's house now, in the front hallway, next to the one of Denise Coleman in her scrubs, that Tyler asked to bring from the old house, and that Elijah had reframed the week the adoption finalized. The new photograph is of the three of them, Elijah, Tyler, and Ava, taken at the chess tournament, where Tyler placed third in his age division, all three of them laughing at something the photographer said, none of them looking at the camera the way people look when a photo is meant to prove something rather than simply catch something that already happened. Simone flew home for the adoption finalization, unprompted, the first time she'd come back to Buffalo outside of a holiday in 2 years. She stood next to her father in the courthouse hallway afterward, a little unsure of her place in a family that had reshaped itself without her, and Ava solved the awkwardness the way children sometimes solve things adults overthink, by simply taking Simone's hand along with Elijah's, as if a bigger sister were just one more warm thing that had shown up on a cold day, and there was no reason to make it complicated. Elijah watched the two of them walk ahead of him down the hallway, talking about something he couldn't hear, and thought that, if he had told the man he was 17 years ago, shivering against a dead truck on Elmwood Avenue, that this was where $40 and a plate of eggs would eventually lead, that man would not have believed a word of it. Elijah still has $3.4 billion, give or take, depending on the quarter. He does not think about that number very often anymore, which is, he has come to believe, the surest evidence anyone could ask for, that it was never really the point. What he thinks about, some nights, standing in the doorway of a room that used to be a guest room, and is now just Ava's room, full of drawings and one rabbit with a hand-sewn ear, is a woman in a diner 17 years ago who did not have much and gave what she had anyway, and how the $40 she never let him repay came back around, eventually, in the form of 2 children who needed exactly what he had learned, the hard way, that money alone was never going to be. Cold doesn't ask who you are before it takes something from you. Elijah's mother was right about that, the way she was right about most things. But she never told him the other half of it, maybe because she never needed to, maybe because she was already living proof of it, folding hospital sheets on a flooded floor for a wage that didn't come close to matching what she gave the people around her. Warmth doesn't ask who you are, either. It doesn't check your bank account before it decides you're worth showing up for. It doesn't wait for the perfect moment, or the tidy ending, or the guarantee that everyone involved will get exactly what they deserve. It just shows up in a stalled truck, or a freezing house, or a courtroom hallway, and it asks only one thing of the person receiving it, that someday, when they can, they pass it on. So here is the question this story leaves you with, the same one Elijah Marsh has never fully stopped asking himself. If you drove past that house on Lafayette Avenue, if you saw one small light flickering in a dark, frozen window on a night when every reasonable instinct told you to keep driving toward your own warm home, would you have stopped? And if the answer is yes, what is stopping you from being the kind of person who stops tonight for whoever's light is flickering in your own life right now? Tell us in the comments what you would have done. Share this with someone who once showed up for you when they didn't have to. And if you want to hear what happens when Tyler finally decides whether to let his uncle back into his life for good, subscribe, because that story's still being written, one supervised visit at a time.